Okay, so today we're really diving deep, and I mean deep, into a pretty pivotal report. It's Chapter 2, specifically from the final report of the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology.
Right. This is the one with a pretty pointed title.
Yeah, they don't mince words, do they? It's called Mobilize the Private Sector to Get U.S. Products to Scale.
And for our listeners, we're aiming to give you that clear understanding of the core arguments, the conclusions they reach, and those specific actions they recommend, all without getting bogged down, you
Exactly, so no slogging through hundreds of pages for you.
know?
We're cutting straight to the heart of how the U.S. can effectively use its innovative private companies to, well, basically supercharge the biotech sector.
And that ultimate goal, it's spelled out right up front in Chapter 2, bolstering both our national security and our economic competitiveness globally, all within this crucial field.
Okay, so let's break this down. Chapter 2 starts by recognizing a real strength, right?
Mhm.
Historically, the U.S. has just been dominant in early-stage biotech funding.
Yeah, it's striking when you see the numbers. We're talking about venture capital investment that dwarfs China's like 3 times greater.
So that seems like a solid foundation, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. On the surface, it looks like a real advantage. And the chapter acknowledges that. These robust capital markets we have here in the US have been a major, major driver of early stage discoveries, getting those initial sparks of innovation going.
But then it pretty quickly points to some serious challenges that are sort of holding back that sustained growth and, the ultimate impact of the U.S. biotech industry.
Yeah, there are some roadblocks that go beyond those initial investments. It's not just about having the money in the beginning.
So what are those challenges? Where exactly are we running into problems?
Well, the chapter really stresses this point, scaling up hard tech innovations. It's like biotech. It's fundamentally different from scaling, say, software.
Right. It's not like you can just add more servers or, hire a bunch of coders and suddenly you've scaled a biological process.
Precisely. You're dealing with living systems, incredibly complex processes. It demands a whole other level of, well, de-risking, both for the science itself and the manufacturing technologies that have to be developed. And then after that, you've got this very capital-intensive phase.
Oh, yeah. Building out those specialized manufacturing capabilities, it's a huge undertaking.
It is, because you're not deploying code, you're
Yeah.
talking about manipulating and growing biological systems at scale. That requires specialized infrastructure, huge investment. And then there's the regulatory hurdle. So many biotech products have these intricate pathways they have to navigate to get approval.
Right. And you need a market at the end of all of that. Customers who are willing to adopt these products pay for them. That's crucial for financial viability and continued growth.
Absolutely. So the whole trajectory from an initial exciting lab discovery to a widely available product in biotech, it's often very lengthy and incredibly expensive.
And all this is happening at a time when the economic landscape has, let's just say, shifted a bit, right? Capital is getting scarcer. Investors are a lot more cautious about risk these days.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Rising interest rates, we've also seen some promising biotech companies that, well, haven't quite delivered the returns people were hoping for. It's made investors a lot more selective, a lot more risk averse.
So that kind of leads to Chapter 2's core conclusion. We can't just rely on the commercial market alone to meet our needs in biotechnology, especially when we're talking about national security. Why do they make that argument? What are the fundamental problems that, well, the market alone just isn't solving?
They lay out 3 really crucial problems. The first one is that infamous valley of death in funding.
Right, the one we always hear about.
You've got venture capital that's happy to fund those early, exciting stages of biotech research and development. And then on the other end, you've got private equity firms, and they might invest once a product's proven, ready for commercialization, but there's this huge gap in between.
Yeah, that tricky middle stage.
And that's when companies need substantial capital. They have to build those pilot manufacturing facilities, conduct large-scale testing, navigate the regulatory process. It's a real danger zone.
So essentially, we're great at the initial spark, but then the momentum stalls because there isn't enough investment to bridge that critical gap.
Exactly. And that leads to the second problem. There's this lack of, well, early adopters who are really confident about these cutting-edge biotechnologies.
I can see why. If you're a company thinking about integrating a brand new biotech product or service into your operations, that comes with risks, right?
Absolutely. Uncertainty about how it will perform, if the supply will be reliable. And a lot of biotech operates in this business-to-business context, right? Specialized enzymes, engineered cell lines, these are components in other industries. So any delays, any performance issues, that have huge downstream effects.
It makes investors even more wary of backing these emerging companies.
Yeah, it's a classic chicken and egg problem. You need those early customers, the ones willing to take a chance, to attract the investment needed to prove the technology, ensure reliable production. But without that proof, potential customers hesitate. It's a vicious cycle.
And then we come to that third problem, right? The competition. And it's not just any competition, it's China.
Yeah, and the chapter is very clear about this. China's biotech sector is expanding at an incredible pace. In some areas, they're already rivaling, even surpassing U.S. firms.
And this isn't just about, who's got the best scientists or the most advanced labs. Chapter 2 uses this term, brute force economics. What exactly does that mean? How does that impact this competition?
It's really the core concept here, brute force economics as they define it. It's a set of policies and practices, very deliberate, very aggressive. It's all driven by the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, with one goal: dominance in strategically important sectors. And biotechnology is a prime target.
So it's not just competing, it's about strategically using every lever they have to dominate this space.
That's exactly it.
Okay, so what kind of tactics are we talking about? The chapter mentions both legal and, illegal approaches. Can you give us some specific examples of what this brute force economics actually looks like in practice?
Sure. On the legal side, there are massive state-backed investments that are just funneled into their domestic biotech companies. They're also incredibly proactive with mergers and acquisitions, targeting foreign firms. They want to acquire valuable technology quickly, get access to established markets.
Like buying their way in, basically.
In a way, yeah. And the chapter specifically mentions Syngenta, a huge global player in agricultural seeds and crop protection that was acquired by ChemChina. Another one was Complete Genomics, a company with leading-edge DNA sequencing technology. They were acquired by BGI. These are just a couple of notable examples.
And those went through review by the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, right? CFIUS.
Right, but the chapter also points out that a lot of other transactions, ones that might have raised concerns, didn't even go through that scrutiny.
Interesting. And what about the illegal tactics? What are those?
There's dumping, where they're selling domestically produced goods at prices that are just way below market value, undercutting international competitors. They also put a lot of pressure on companies, even talented individuals, to relocate to China. And then there's just outright theft, stealing intellectual property, sensitive data.
It doesn't sound like a level playing field at all.
That's the point Chapter 2 is making. This isn't normal market competition. It's calculated, strategic. They're using potentially unfair and illicit means to gain dominance.
And are there specific companies that they point to as examples of how China is successfully doing this in the biotech sector?
Oh yeah, there are a few. One that stands out is WuXi AppTec. They're described as a global biopharmaceutical services giant. They've grown enormously through acquisitions, both in the U.S. and internationally.
Like gobbling up other companies?
Yeah. They acquired Oxford Genetics, Research Point Global, HD Biosciences, AppTec Laboratory Services, just to name a few.
So they've become pretty deeply integrated into the supply chains of a lot of American companies.
Absolutely. The chapter even mentions some U.S. firms estimating that it would take them at least 8 years to find and secure alternative providers.
8 years. Wow. That's a real vulnerability.
It is. And then there's BGI. They were mentioned before with the acquisition of Complete Genomics.
Right. How do they illustrate this impact?
Well, Chapter 2 suggests that BGI might be operating less as a purely private company and more as, an extension of the CCP, benefiting from state subsidies, that sort of thing.
Interesting.
And they've boosted their technological capabilities significantly through that acquisition of Complete Genomics, but also, importantly, through alleged infringement on patented sequencing technology. That's technology held by Illumina, an American company.
So state backing and access to American IP, that's a powerful combination.
It is. It's allowed them to undercut market prices for DNA sequencing. Back in 2020, they were reportedly offering human genome sequencing for as little as $100. That's really striking.
That is incredibly cheap. And I remember reading about U.S. biotech firms being offered free manufacturing facilities in China. Is that something the chapter mentions?
They do. It's another concerning tactic. They're basically saying, Move your operations to China and we'll give you a fully built custom manufacturing facility, no charge.
Wow. And this is often coming from Chinese entities that are backed by subsidies from Beijing.
Right. So it's a very direct and potentially appealing way to incentivize the relocation of American innovation, creates more dependencies.
So the big risk here, as Chapter 2 lays it out, is that we could become way too reliant on China for our biotechnology, vulnerable both economically and in terms of national security.
Exactly. That's the fundamental concern driving this whole analysis. And they argue that the U.S. government really needs to step up, take proactive steps to counter these efforts by China. They need to implement measures designed to unleash American innovation, attract that private capital we talked about, and build up our domestic manufacturing capacity in biotech.
Which brings us to the recommendations, right?
Yeah.
What actions does the chapter specifically propose?
They put forward 5 core recommendations, all aimed at mobilizing the U.S. private sector to support biotechnology. They see these as essential for countering China's advantages and accelerating the development of beneficial biotechnologies, but doing it here in the United States.
Okay, so what are those 5 recommendations?
First, simplify regulation for American biotechnology companies. Second, attract private capital to support biotechnology. Third, scale up and de-risk manufacturing of bioproducts in the U.S. Fourth, protect critical biotechnology infrastructure. And fifth, fight back against brute force economics.
They're not shying away from strong language, are they?
Not at all. These are big tasks, each with its own set of challenges.
Definitely. Let's dive a little deeper into a couple of these. I think it would be helpful to really understand the chapter's thinking and what actions could be taken. Let's start with simplifying regulation. The chapter really goes into the fragmented nature of the current regulatory landscape.
It's a real problem. They point out that we have over 15 different federal offices and programs involved in regulating biotechnology. That's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, so to speak.
And it sounds like it creates a lot of confusion and inefficiency.
Yeah, absolutely. But 3 agencies are really the key players. USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, APAS, the FDA, and the EPA. The problem is there's no single empowered entity to standardize those regulatory processes or even resolve overlaps in jurisdiction.
So it's a bit of a bureaucratic maze for these innovators. What specific challenges does this create for them?
They list 4 main challenges. First, innovators often don't even know which agency has primary oversight for their specific product. Second, they have to navigate these overlapping, sometimes inconsistent processes across multiple agencies. Third, there are what they call unnecessary regulatory burdens, often applied to products that are already well understood and have a good safety record. And finally, even when innovators successfully navigate all of that, the agencies themselves often have limited resources and capacity. That can lead to huge delays, unpredictable delays in the approval process.
So the system kind of treats well-understood biotech like it's something totally new and groundbreaking.
Yeah, and that stifles progress. They have a great example in the chapter about engineered insects.
Yeah, the ones that kept getting bounced back and forth between agencies for ages.
Exactly. These were gene-drive mosquitoes engineered to reduce disease transmission or control their own populations. They were stuck in this regulatory limbo for nearly a decade. But similar mosquitoes that were modified using conventional breeding techniques, they got approval in about 5 years.
That's a huge difference. And it's not just about totally new technologies, is it? Even for biotech products that are similar to what's already on the market, that regulatory pathway can be a real slog.
That's a key point. They mention non-browning apples and potatoes, which have gone through the whole approval process. But there's no mechanism to use those approvals to expedite the review of similar products.
So something like a non-browning avocado, peach, or pear, even if it's the same underlying trait, would probably face the same long, resource-intensive review.
It's very likely, and that's a problem. They're calling for a system that focuses on the actual novelty and risk of the specific innovation, not just treating everything the same.
So what's the solution they propose?
They introduce this idea of a National Biotechnology Coordination Office, the NBCO. They recommend establishing this office and giving it real power to simplify the regulation of biotech products.
So like a central point of contact, a regulatory traffic cop.
Exactly. They envision the NBCO leading and coordinating regulatory efforts across all the relevant agencies, although the agencies would still have the final say.
Okay, so it's about streamlining and making the process more efficient and predictable.
Right. They also want the NDCO to map out clear regulatory pathways for different types of products, develop digital infrastructure to make the application and review process smoother, and just improve communication and transparency overall.
Makes sense. And they also mentioned this idea of a regulatory sandbox. What is that?
It's an interesting idea for new types of biotech products or regulatory approaches where there isn't a clear path yet. They suggest creating a regulatory sandbox.
It's like a controlled environment to test things out.
Exactly. It would be a way for developers and regulators to work together, test out streamlined processes, gather real-world data in a contained setting, and then potentially implement those changes more broadly.
That seems like a smart way to introduce flexibility and evidence-based iteration. Okay, let's move on to that third key recommendation. Scaling up and de-risking the manufacturing of bioproducts here in the U.S. What are the main challenges there?
The big one is just the lack of sufficient biomanufacturing capacity. They point out that, yeah, U.S. researchers are developing all these amazing new biotech products, but our ability to manufacture them at scale is lagging behind.
So we're strong on R&D, but then we hit a bottleneck when it comes to actually producing things.
Right, and building new biomanufacturing facilities is hugely expensive and takes a lot of time. You're talking hundreds of millions of dollars for pre-commercial facilities, billions for commercial scale facilities. Plus, those commercial scale facilities can take years to construct.
So we're back to that valley of death again. The initial spark is there, but then we struggle to fuel sustained growth because we can't scale up effectively.
It's a major issue. They also touch on emerging trends in manufacturing, like automation and continuous manufacturing processes. These could potentially lead to smaller, less expensive, and more efficient facilities.
That sounds promising.
It is, but the biopharmaceutical and bioindustrial sectors have been a bit slow to adopt these innovations. There are concerns about regulatory acceptance, about recouping those initial investments in new technology.
There's a little section in Chapter 2 called Biomanufacturing 101, and they specifically talk about fermentation. Why highlight that process in particular?
Because it's currently the most common form of biomanufacturing. It uses living microorganisms to transform raw materials into all sorts of valuable products. Think beer, but also complex therapies and biofuels.
So it's a fundamental technology for the bioeconomy.
It really is. And understanding those principles and the challenges with scaling up fermentation, that's key when we're talking about overall biomanufacturing capacity.
So what do they recommend we do to address this lack of capacity?
The big recommendation here is for Congress to fund the DOE and the DOC to establish a national network of advanced manufacturing facilities. And these facilities would be specifically designed for pre-commercial scale-up of bioindustrial products.
Okay, so it's about creating shared infrastructure that innovators, especially smaller companies, can use to prove their technologies at larger scales.
Exactly. And that would make them more attractive to investors and commercial partners. It's directly addressing that valley of death problem.
There's this interesting point in Chapter 2 where they say that the U.S. actually already has a lot of the right conditions for industrial biotech scale-up. So why are so many companies going overseas to scale up their manufacturing?
That's a really good question. We have abundant and diverse feedstocks, reliable utilities, a great transportation network, and we're close to large consumer markets.
Seems like we have all the ingredients.
Right. But despite that, companies often decide to scale up elsewhere, especially after the initial R&D phase. It's probably due to a mix of factors. Lower operating costs in some places, more streamlined regulatory environments for manufacturing, maybe even the availability of specialized expertise that's developed elsewhere.
So these proposed facilities, they're meant to counteract that trend by giving companies the infrastructure and support they need to scale up here in the U.S.
Exactly. Make it more competitive, more attractive to stay here.
Okay, so we've gone over simplifying regulation and scaling up manufacturing. How do these efforts, which seem pretty focused on domestic issues, connect back to that national security concern that's framing the whole chapter?
It's all connected. By boosting our domestic biotech sector, we reduce our reliance on foreign sources, especially China, for essential biotechnologies. That means stronger domestic resilience, fewer vulnerabilities in our supply chains.
So we're less dependent on others for crucial things like pharmaceuticals, advanced materials, even food production.
Precisely. A strong, innovative biotech sector here at home is essential for national defense, for resilient supply chains, for public health security. These are all fundamental to national security.
And all of this is about more than just being economically competitive, right? It's about ensuring that we can protect our interests and the well-being of our citizens.
That's the core message. They're really emphasizing the potential for U.S. leadership in biotechnology to drive the development and deployment of beneficial innovations, not just for economic gains, but for the overall security and health of the nation.
Yeah, so it's a pretty big picture view.
It is.
Well, I think this has been a really insightful look at Chapter 2. To summarize, it seems like there's a real urgency to mobilize the U.S. private sector in biotech. It's about countering those challenges posed by China's advancements and their strategic economic policies. And the chapter highlights the hurdles that U.S. companies are facing, from funding to regulation to manufacturing.
Right. And they're presenting these core recommendations, simplifying regulation, investing in biomanufacturing as crucial steps to address those challenges and maintain U.S. leadership in this critical sector.
And they're not pulling any punches in terms of the language they're using. They're talking about fighting back, about taking proactive steps to protect our national security.
They are. It's a strong message, and they back it up with a lot of detailed analysis. They make a very compelling case for government action to support and de-risk private sector innovation and growth in biotechnology.
So it's about fostering innovation, but also ensuring security. It's a complex balance.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to our final thought for you, the listener. Considering this balance between rapid innovation in biotech and national security, what changes, either in regulation or in government support, do you think would have the biggest positive impact on the U.S. biotech ecosystem?
It's a question worth thinking about, and we encourage you to check out the full final report. It has a lot more detailed analysis and recommendations. It's a really valuable resource.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into a topic that's shaping the future of U.S. biotechnology and national security.
Until next time, stay curious.
Stay curious.